Hello, everyone. Welcome to my short little lecture on geoprocessing for Chapter 9. I know I've talked about geoprocessing quite a bit, but as you can tell, it's a pretty important thing that we do. So I just wanted to go over a few things about it, doing it, just to help reiterate the process and why we're doing it and what's going on. Okay, so let's move forward. Just a caveat before we go on, you'll notice that the illustrations I have look a little different from ArcPro. These are all screenshots from ArcMap Desktop. So I didn't really want to go in and redo everything. Maybe I will in the future, but the point is very much the same, and I think everything will make sense. It's obviously looks different on ArcPro, but not that much different. I think you'll understand what it is. It's just it gives you a little idea of how the interface is different. Okay, so what is geoprocessing? I know we've talked about this before, but the most important thing to remember is that you're taking your layer, one layer, you're asking it to do a function on it, run some math, asking a question of it to get a new output. So as you can see here, we have all of these, let's see, highlighter, these toolboxes. We're always going to be going to these toolboxes. There are many, many of them. And we have this little instant menu that comes down here. It's the same in Pro. You have a little quick selection of things we use quite often. And it's the same thing. So these are ones we just use a lot. So the idea is that you're getting a new layer to result from your actions. So we've seen something similar to this before when we're looking at all of our select by locations that we did in Chapter 8. So that's the new symbol for a layer there, is that little yellow diamond. There are some differences with spatial joins. We are bringing together attributes where the geometry intersects, overlaps, or is within a distance, depending on what is permitted by the geometry. And your source data table is appended where the intersection occurs. With select by location, you set the spatial rules for the selection as well as the source and target layer, and a selection is produced from that. A new layer is created only when you export or create a new layer from the selection. So you'll notice in this lab, there are times when you ask it to just select certain features or certain attributes, but it doesn't create a new layer with the select by location tool, though you can select a layer for it. And there are multiple workarounds for that. And he does it one way in the lab, and in the future, I'll show you my other way of doing it, which is essentially just doing a right click, but you have to go down into the right menu a little bit. But with general geoprocessing tools in general, and with the specific geoprocessing tools we're working with in today's lab, the attribute table is changed, excuse me, depending on the nature of the spatial relationship between the inputs and commands. And the reason I bring up the attribute table is because as we're learning GIS and learning how to work in Pro and work with all the different features this has, it's good to just note how your data is changing as you make these geoprocessing tools create new layers. Just helps to keep you in line with what's going on and double checking your work. So how geoprocessing tools are different. There are many similarities in how joins and select by location commands work, and even SQL to an extent. You have a source layer, or you have an input or target, and you have a question to ask of the layer, and you generate a new layer from that. But geoprocessing tools in general have a much more straightforward interface and customizability. So you'll see as we start working with them more and more, they're nice because it tells you exactly what you need. And if you don't fulfill that criteria, it won't run, and it'll tell you right away. So there's not going to be a big question mark as to like what you don't have. It'll let you know it's not going to work. It'll also let you know when it doesn't work if something wasn't the correct kind of layer. So I said in that last slide that there are hundreds of them. Again, this is the what it looked like in the ArcGIS desktop, but this is just a small sample size of what's available just under the Spatial Analyst toolbox. And there are many other toolboxes. There's hundreds and hundreds of tools to use that you can do many kinds of things with. So one thing I really want to stress in this lab, and that you will be using over and over again, so it should become second nature for you, is about setting environments. Again, this looks a little different in ArcPro, but the idea is exactly the same. Where I think I have that. Yeah. Oh no, I don't do it there. Oh, let me go back. Okay, well, I can't go back right now on this how PowerPoint has me recording this. So let me just say it, my 2 cents on setting environments. You'll be doing it early on in the lab in Chapter 9. And basically what you're doing in this case is you're telling ArcPro where to save your outputs. You're going to be producing many, many outputs as you run geoprocessing tools. And as you can imagine, it can get very cluttered. So by setting environments, you're telling the computer exactly where to save everything. You're also telling the projection you want it to be in, and doing lots of other useful stuff. So for this lab, we're actually not doing a ton of detailed work with our environments, but the possibility is there, and you will be using them in greater detail when we do other kinds of lab work, such as dealing with rasters. But even with this more simple stuff, like just running geoprocessing tools, it's really helpful to have everything saving in the right spot. And you'll see as you go through the lab where things are popping up as you start creating more and more outputs. So this slide just highlights something we've already covered a bit I think in GIST, so those of you who were in that class will recognize this slide. But these are some of the fundamental overlays and tools that we use, and he goes into more detail on these in the book. So I wanted to just mention a little bit what happens to some of the attribute data when you run these geoprocessing tools. So when you clip, as it might imply, you get a shorter attribute table because you're taking information, extracting it, and making a smaller data set. When you're buffering, you're actually creating an entirely new piece of geometry because you're essentially drawing a circle around a point or a circle around a polygon. So that circle then becomes its own shape and its own piece of information, its own piece of geometry. So buffered attribute table only has one line. And when you merge, of course, you bring two things together. So merge is a sort of like a join, except instead of using attribute data, it's using the geometry. So merge, union, append, and join. These are simple ones that are kind of easier to understand, but there's others that I still struggle with kind of keeping track of exactly what they mean. So I always have to refer back to these charts to see what it is all the other things you do exactly mean. Just take a moment to read over them in the book and know that you'll probably also have to be looking back at them frequently. It's sort of like a visual example of doing Boolean operators is how I see it. So requirements for running geoprocessing. You will always need an input layer, something to be analyzed, and you will always need to ensure that where the output is being sent is where you want it to be. Again, then we do that by setting environments. And a geoprocessing tool won't run unless you've satisfied the minimum amount of data and parameters. And these tools can take, on average, 30 to 90 seconds to run. These two tools we use in this lab coming up are pretty quick, so they should process pretty fast, but it can take a long time, and sometimes you just have to be patient. Again, double check it's saving where you want it to, and it's really easy to delete and repeat if something doesn't turn out right. It's very user-friendly that way, and you'll notice that things show up in your table of contents, but they also show up in your geodatabase where you told it to save it. If you don't like it, you just can take it out of your table of contents, but you still have the data in your geodatabase if you still want it there for some reason.